Collins, once a
Collins, my
loyal
love,
assistant
I
to the
can't
powerful
imagine my
Pastor
world
Geoffrey,
without you.
discovers
Please
the
marry
dark
me.
source behind his uncle's miracles. Torn between truth and ambition, he breaks away to build his
I am a
own
pastor
ministry,
and you're a
vowing to
priestess.
lead
We
with
are of different
integrity.
faith. It's not going to
But when
work.
he crosses paths with Idara, a powerful chief priestess, he is tempted by the promise of wealth, fame, and supernatural power. As Collins rises to prominence, the cost of his ambition becomes clear: his soul. What began as a quest for truth becomes a journey into darkness, where every miracle comes at a price. Please encourage us by subscribing to this channel, hit the like button, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments section. Collins had always been a brilliant young man, a student of excellence who excelled in both secondary school and university. He had an innate curiosity and a sharp mind, traits that made him stand out in every classroom he entered. Yet, the true turning point in his life came when he moved in with his uncle, Pastor Geoffrey, a man whose reputation seemed to reach every corner of the
Declare
city.
prosperity upon all of
Pastor
you.
Geoffrey was not just any preacher. He
Healing
was
and
a
deliverance
phenomenon,
shall be
a
your
man
portion
known
both
for
now
performing
and forever.
miracles that left people awestruck. His name was spoken with reverence in the city, especially among the women who flocked to his church, hoping for a healing, a breakthrough, or a divine intervention in their lives. He was a miracle worker, a man of God whose very presence made people believe that they were in the company of something extraordinary. To Collins, this was the world he had entered. He admired his uncle greatly. Growing up in a small town, he had never encountered anyone with such charisma and influence. Pastor Geoffrey had a way of making the impossible seem possible, and Collins was drawn to this energy. It was inevitable that Collins would follow in his footsteps. He became the pastor's personal assistant, traveling with him to various crusades in different cities, states, and even countries. Wherever Pastor Geoffrey went, miracles seemed to follow. Collins' role was simple: assist with logistics, help with church events, and provide support during the crusades. It was a glamorous life that many envied, and to Collins, it was a dream come true. The energy at the crusades was electric. People shouted in praise, fell to the ground in worship, and marveled at the so-called divine healings taking place. His uncle seemed to have the divine touch, a gift from God that allowed him to heal the sick, cast out demons, and perform other miracles that left the congregation spellbound. However, Collins soon realized that his admiration for his uncle would soon come into conflict with his growing curiosity. There were certain things about Pastor Geoffrey's ministry that didn't quite add up. The way people were healed in a sudden and dramatic fashion, the seemingly instant transformations that took place, and the manner in which his uncle always appeared to know just what to say, it all felt too rehearsed. But Collins, in his youth and naivety, dismissed these doubts. After all, his uncle was a man of God, and miracles had to come from divine power, right? That was until one fateful trip to Asaba, a trip that would change the course of his life forever. Pastor Geoffrey had told his wife he would be traveling to Asaba for a crusade, and as usual, Collins accompanied him. They traveled by road, discussing plans for the event, talking about the healing service, and the people who would be coming to witness the miracles. Collins was excited, but there was an odd feeling in the air that he couldn't quite place. When they arrived in Asaba, Pastor Geoffrey's demeanor changed. There was a coldness in his eyes, a look that Collins hadn't seen before. The usual warmth that his uncle exuded during their travels was absent. Collins followed him quietly as they entered a nondescript building, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It wasn't a hotel, nor was it a church, it was something else entirely. Inside the building, Collins met someone for the first time, a man with a dark presence. He was known only as the Source, a native doctor who was rumored to have mystical powers. The man, with his deep, unsettling eyes and calm demeanor, welcomed Collins and Pastor Geoffrey into his domain. He offered them drinks, though Collins hesitated to drink. Something about the man's presence made him feel uneasy. Pastor Geoffrey seemed entirely at ease, as though he had visited this place many times before. Collins watched carefully as the native doctor began preparing a mixture of herbs and concoctions, performing rituals that seemed ancient and arcane. The air in the room felt thick with something unknown, something dark. It was in that moment, as Collins observed the ritual, that the truth hit him like a hammer. Pastor Geoffrey's miracles were not from God. The powers that allowed him to heal the sick, perform exorcisms, and work wonders, these were the result of dark, supernatural forces. The so-called miracles were nothing more than an elaborate trick, a facade that masked the true source of Geoffrey's abilities. Pastor Geoffrey must have sensed the shift in Colin's demeanor, for his tone became colder when he finally spoke. "What you see here, Collins, must remain between us. If you say a word to anyone, you will regret it. This is my source of power. Do not even think of revealing it, or you will pay the price." The weight of the words hung in the air. Collins, stunned and horrified, could only nod in silence. His world was crashing down around him. The man he had admired, the man who had shaped his vision of faith, had been living a lie all along. But the power and influence were too great to ignore, and Collins knew that if he wanted to make it in this world, he would have to play along, at least for now. The ride back home was a quiet one. Pastor Geoffrey didn't say much, but Collins couldn't shake the image of the source and the ritual he had witnessed. The truth was now clear, and it was something he couldn't unsee. It was the beginning of a dark journey, one that would lead him to question everything he had been taught and everything he believed in. Collins knew he couldn't stay silent forever, but the fear of what would happen if he spoke out kept him bound in place. Pastor Geoffrey's warning rang in his ears. What would it cost him to expose the truth? And would anyone believe him if he did? For now, Collins kept the secret, burying it deep within himself. He went back to his duties as Pastor Geoffrey's assistant, helping with church events, traveling for crusades, and performing his role in the ministry. But something inside him had changed. The man he had once looked up to was no longer a hero, he was just another man with a dark secret. The journey ahead would be filled with difficult decisions, but for now, Collins was trapped in a world of lies, unable to escape the grip of the man who had once been his idol. Time passed, but the shadow of what Collins had discovered in Asaba lingered, haunting him like a silent specter. Pastor Geoffrey's words echoed in his mind, "If you value your life, you will say nothing." It was a chilling threat, and yet, as the weeks turned into months, Collins found himself unable to escape the reality of what he had seen. The truth had been revealed, and it had cracked the foundation of everything he had once believed in. Collins tried to push the memories of that night from his mind, but the more he ignored them, the more they consumed him. He had once looked up to Pastor Geoffrey as a spiritual giant, an embodiment of faith and divine power. But now, every sermon, every healing session, felt like a lie. Collins couldn't look at his uncle the same way anymore. The miracles Pastor Geoffrey performed with such flair, restoring sight to the blind, healing the sick, raising the dead, were nothing more than elaborate tricks. The power was not divine, but rooted in something darker. The realization left Collins feeling hollow, like a man who had been deceived for his entire life. Collins couldn't reconcile this new truth with the man he had known and loved. There were moments when he would watch Pastor Geoffrey in action, surrounded by the throngs of people who believed in his divine gifts, and he would feel a deep sense of betrayal. How could his uncle, a man who preached righteousness, be the very one who sold his soul to dark forces for power? How could he continue to lead people down a path of lies? But the more Collins grappled with his disillusionment, the more he realized that he was trapped. He couldn't just walk away. His life, his career, had been tied to the success of Pastor Geoffrey's ministry. He had been the faithful assistant, traveling the world with him, playing a key role in the miraculous events that drew crowds and built the Church's empire. To expose his uncle's secrets would be to tear apart the life he had worked so hard to build. But staying silent wasn't an option either, it was like living in a prison, surrounded by lies and deceit. The tension in Collins' heart grew unbearable. He began to question everything. Was faith real? He wondered. Was this all just an illusion? The struggle within him deepened. He couldn't deny the miracles he had seen, people who were genuinely healed, lives that were changed. But now, he understood that these weren't works of God. They were carefully orchestrated events, brought about by rituals that had nothing to do with divine intervention. As Collins continued to assist Pastor Geoffrey in his ministry, he became more withdrawn, more observant, and less willing to turn a blind eye. He saw how Pastor Geoffrey manipulated the crowds, using his powers not to help people, but to build an empire, a kingdom of influence and wealth. It sickened Collins. His uncle was not the man of God he had always appeared to be, he was a charlatan, a fraud. But there was something else, something darker, that Collins couldn't shake off. Pastor Geoffrey had grown suspicious of him. Collins had always been a loyal assistant, but his behavior had begun to change, his movements more deliberate, his questions more probing. Pastor Geoffrey, ever the sharp-eyed manipulator, noticed the shift. One afternoon, as they sat in the study of their church office, Pastor Geoffrey looked at Collins with an unreadable expression. "You've been quiet lately, Collins," he said, his voice low, yet laced with authority. "Something on your mind?" Collins hesitated, unsure of what to say. His mind raced, but he couldn't bring himself to speak the truth. Instead, he smiled weakly, trying to mask the turmoil inside. "Just tired, Uncle. Lots to think about." Pastor Geoffrey's gaze never wavered. "I know you, Collins," he said, leaning forward. "You're not the same. I know when something's bothering you. You've seen something, haven't you?" The words hung in the air like a threat. Collins' heart pounded in his chest. He knew what his uncle was implying. He could feel the weight of the unspoken truth pressing down on him. The betrayal of the man he had trusted, the man he had once looked up to, was staring him in the face. "You think you're the only one who knows the secret?" Pastor Geoffrey continued, his tone turning colder. "You think you can expose me and get away with it? I built this ministry, Collins. I made it what it is. Don't forget that." Collins swallowed hard. He knew then that his uncle would stop at nothing to protect his empire. Pastor Geoffrey was a man of power, and power, as Collins had learned, had its price. The moment of silence that followed felt like an eternity. Collins could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He was trapped. Pastor Geoffrey was not only his uncle but also his boss, his mentor, the very person who had given him the life he had. Exposing him could destroy everything, his reputation, his career, and the life he had worked so hard to build. But continuing to serve a man who was nothing but a fraud felt like a slow death. "I won't say anything, Uncle," Collins finally said, his voice thick with tension. "But I can't continue this way. I need to move on. I need to start something of my own." Pastor Geoffrey's expression hardened, but there was no surprise in his eyes. He had seen it coming. "You think you can just walk away from me?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. "If you think for 1 second that I won't destroy you, you're wrong." Collins felt a shiver run down his spine. The threat was real, and for the first time, he understood the true nature of the man he had admired for so long. Pastor Geoffrey had built his empire on secrets, on manipulation, on lies. And Collins was now caught in the middle of it all. The conversation ended there, but the damage had been done. Collins knew he couldn't stay in the ministry any longer. He couldn't live under the shadow of Pastor Geoffrey's lies. And yet, he also knew that breaking free would come at a high price. That night, as he lay in bed, Collins made a decision. He would leave. He would expose the truth, even if it meant sacrificing everything he had built. He couldn't continue to serve a man who had sold his soul for power. He would start his own church, and he would do it on his own terms. But as he drifted off to sleep, a gnawing sense of fear lingered in his heart. Pastor Geoffrey wasn't the type to let anyone walk away without consequences. Collins had made his choice. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with uncertainty and danger. But there was no turning back. The betrayal had already begun, and there was no way to undo the damage that had been done. The weeks following Collins' departure from Pastor Geoffrey's ministry were filled with uncertainty and turmoil. The weight of his decision to break away from his uncle was immense, yet it was also liberating. Collins had always known that there was something deeply wrong with the way things were being run, but leaving the ministry meant stepping into the unknown. He had no support from his uncle, no guarantees, no clear path forward. Still, Collins was determined. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the one thing that had held him back all these years wasn't just loyalty to Pastor Geoffrey, it was fear. Fear of failure. Fear of being nothing without the reputation of his uncle's name behind him. But now, free from that influence, he saw his future in a new light. If he could build something on his own, something honest, something that didn't rely on deception or false miracles, maybe he could make a real difference. The first few months were a struggle. Collins didn't have the network that Pastor Geoffrey had, nor did he have the financial resources to jumpstart a large ministry. All he had was his name, his reputation from his years spent working with Geoffrey, and his passion. But passion alone wasn't enough. Collins realized that he would need a foundation built on trust, transparency, and genuine faith. He started small. In the quiet of his room, he began to write the vision for his ministry, a vision that was different from his uncle's. He envisioned a church that was based on real transformation, where people came not just for miracles, but for true healing of the mind, body, and spirit. He wanted a place where people could come, not just seeking material gain or quick fixes, but seeking purpose and direction in their lives. The journey would be long, but Collins was ready. He reached out to a few trusted contacts he had made during his time with Pastor Geoffrey, and to his surprise, many of them were willing to follow him. Some were disillusioned with Geoffrey's practices, others simply wanted to be part of something real. Collins took them in, and together, they began organizing small prayer meetings and Bible studies. They gathered in a small hall on the outskirts of the city, away from the flashy lights and extravagant crusades that defined Pastor Geoffrey's ministry. The road was not easy. Collins had to work tirelessly to get people to trust him. Some came out of curiosity, others out of desperation. He preached messages of hope, of genuine salvation, of faith rooted in truth rather than in the allure of miracles. But the crowds were small, and for months, he struggled to fill the seats. There were moments of doubt, times when Collins questioned whether he had made the right decision. He had left the comforts of a large ministry, the fame and security of being Pastor Geoffrey's assistant, only to be faced with empty pews and dwindling funds. Yet, through it all, Collins remained steadfast. He prayed fervently, asking for guidance and strength. He reflected on the teachings of Jesus, how he had started with nothing but a message of love and salvation, and how his ministry had grown into something that changed the world forever. Collins knew that if he remained true to his calling, his own ministry would eventually take root. One day, things began to shift. Collins received a call from a wealthy businessman. A man who had heard about the new church and wanted to meet him. The businessman had been disillusioned with the lavish lifestyle of other ministries, particularly the flashy displays of wealth that had become synonymous with Pastor Geoffrey's church. He had seen the sincerity in Collins and wanted to support him. With this new financial backing, Collins was able to rent a larger space, and slowly, the crowds began to grow. Word spread about the new church that focused on truth and healing rather than fame and miracles. More people began to join, not because they were promised wealth or a quick fix to their problems, but because they believed in Collins' message of genuine change. The church, though small, became a beacon of hope for those who had been burned by false prophets and deceitful leaders. But even as the ministry began to grow, Collins found himself facing new challenges. With success came the temptation to compromise. As his church expanded, so did the pressures to perform, to give people what they wanted. The pressure to promise miracles, to create a spectacle that would rival the grand crusades of his uncle's ministry, was ever present. One evening, as Collins was alone in his office, reviewing the church's financial statements, he was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Samuel, a former assistant pastor who had joined Collins' ministry after leaving Geoffrey's church. Samuel, a loyal follower, had been with Collins through the hardest times, and had seen the transformation of the small church into something growing and impactful. "Pastor, can I speak with you?" Samuel asked, stepping inside. Of course, Samuel. What's on your mind? Samuel hesitated, clearly wrestling with something. I've been thinking, he began, about the way things are going here. The people, they're expecting more. They're expecting the miracles, the signs, the wonders that they saw at Pastor Geoffrey's church. They're not here just for your sermons, Pastor, they want the supernatural. Colin sighed, rubbing his temples. I know, Samuel. But I don't want to give them that. Not in the way Geoffrey did. We've worked hard to build this ministry on truth, not on illusions. I understand, Samuel said, sitting down. But you know how it works. The crowds come for miracles, for the spectacle. If you don't give them that, they'll move on to the next thing. People are fickle. They want what's easy, what's flashy. And honestly, Pastor, some of us, we've been wondering, if you could do just one or two things, just a little bit like Geoffrey did, maybe people would start to take us seriously. The conversation left Collins feeling torn. He understood the pressures of leading a growing ministry. The temptation to perform, to give the people what they wanted, was real. But deep down, he knew that compromising his principles would be a betrayal of everything he had worked for. That night, Collins prayed harder than he had ever prayed before. He asked for strength to resist the temptation of false promises, for guidance on how to keep his ministry true to its purpose. He thought about the journey he had taken to get to this point, and the sacrifices he had made. He realized that it wasn't about the size of the crowd or the grandeur of the miracles. It was about staying true to his calling, no matter the cost. In the days that followed, Collins made it clear to his congregation that while he would pray for healing and miracles, he would not engage in the theatrics that had become so prevalent in modern ministry. His church would remain a place of truth, of deep faith, and of genuine transformation, not a place for spectacle. The choice was difficult, but it was also a defining moment. Collins understood that success in ministry was not measured by the number of people or the miracles that could be performed, but by the impact it had on the lives of those who genuinely sought change. And with that, the ministry continued to grow, not because of miracles, but because of something much stronger, the truth. Collins' church had begun to thrive. Slowly but steadily, his ministry was gaining traction, and word was spreading about the young pastor who preached authenticity in a world filled with false promises. The congregation, though still small in comparison to the megachurches led by his former uncle, Pastor Geoffrey, was loyal and hungry for truth. Collins worked tirelessly, visiting members, holding private counseling sessions, and personally overseeing every aspect of his church. He felt a growing sense of purpose with every sermon he delivered. But the road to success was not without its challenges. As the church began to flourish, the pressures mounted. Collins knew that he could not keep running the church on his own forever. He needed support, and the larger his congregation grew, the more he realized how much he lacked in the ways of influence and connections. Collins wanted his church to grow even more, to reach people beyond the walls of his small meeting hall. The drive for greater success and recognition, though still tempered by his desire to stay true to his values, lingered in the back of his mind. It was at this moment of ambition that Collins encountered someone who would change the course of his life in ways he never anticipated. Her name was Idara. She was no ordinary woman. A chief priestess of a powerful spiritual order, Idara was a woman of great influence, her powers and influence extending far beyond the realm of religious practices. She was the head of an ancient, secretive cult that had helped several pastors rise to prominence in exchange for their allegiance and service. Her reputation in the spiritual world was formidable, and those who sought her help were often rewarded with wealth, influence, and success. To an outsider, Idara might have appeared enigmatic or even dangerous, but to Collins, she was something entirely different, an opportunity. Their first meeting was anything but ordinary. It took place at a private gathering in a lavish, dimly lit room where the air seemed to pulse with unspoken energy. Collins was introduced to Idara by one of his newfound contacts, an influential businessman who had ties to the upper echelons of society. Idara's presence in the room was magnetic, commanding the attention of everyone around her without a single word. She didn't need to speak, her very presence was enough to make others fall silent. Idara was tall and statuesque, dressed in an intricate robe that reflected the richness of her heritage. Her eyes, dark and unblinking, seemed to peer straight into Colin's soul as if she knew every secret he had buried within himself. There was something in her gaze, a mixture of power and mystery, that unsettled him, but it also intrigued him deeply. As the evening unfolded, Collins couldn't help but watch her every move. She was charismatic, articulate, and strangely comforting. Even in the midst of the intensity that radiated from her. The other guests seemed to hang on her every word, nodding in agreement as she spoke of power, influence, and spiritual matters beyond the understanding of most. Collins, still unsure of the nature of her work, wasn't prepared for the directness with which she approached him later that night. "I've been watching you, Collins," Idara said, her voice low and rich with meaning. "You're building something here, aren't you? A church. A ministry. But you're still struggling. You know it's not enough to just preach truth. You need more." Collins blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, trying to mask his nervousness. Idara smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a chill down Collins' spine. "I mean that you've built the foundation, but you need power. Power to make your mark, to become something more than just a small-time pastor. I have what you need, Collins. I can help you." Collins didn't know how to respond. His initial instinct was to reject her offer, to walk away from the world she was hinting at, but something inside him hesitated. There was a part of him, the same part that had driven him to start his own church despite the risks, that recognized the opportunity she was presenting. This wasn't just about growing a church. This was about growing his church. It was about taking his ministry to heights he had only ever dreamed of. "I don't understand," Collins said slowly, his voice cautious. "What exactly are you offering?" Idara leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "I am offering you power, Collins. The same power that helped other pastors rise from nothing to something. The same power that will give you everything you've ever wanted, fame, influence, wealth, and success. All I ask in return is your loyalty. I want you to be mine, Collins. I want you to be my husband." The words hit Collins like a physical blow. He stumbled back, uncertain of what to make of this proposition. A chief priestess asking him to marry her. It was unthinkable. His mind raced with the consequences. His congregation would never accept him marrying a priestess of such a powerful and mysterious order. His uncle's ministry had always been tied to the idea of purity, of divine calling. This would destroy everything he had worked for. But Idara wasn't asking for a marriage in the traditional sense. She wasn't asking for a conventional partnership. No, this was a spiritual union, a merging of powers. In the eyes of those who followed her, this would elevate Collins to a position of unimaginable power. He would not just be a pastor, he would be something more, something beyond the earthly world. "Think about it, Collins," Idara continued, sensing his hesitation. "This is what you want, isn't it? To rise above the ordinary, to be a man of great influence. You want to build an empire, just like your uncle did, but without the lies. I am the key to that. Marry me, and I will make you the most powerful pastor this world has ever seen." The offer was tempting. It was everything Collins had ever dreamed of, everything he had ever wanted. He had spent so many years watching others rise to prominence, wishing for the same recognition and success. This was the opportunity to make it happen. But the cost was great. Marrying a priestess, aligning himself with a mysterious spiritual force, he knew it would have consequences. The people who followed him, those who had come to trust him for his honesty, would never accept this. They would see it as a betrayal, and the truth he had worked so hard to build would crumble. Idara could see the conflict in Collins' eyes. She leaned back in her chair, watching him closely. "It'll give you time to think about it," she said softly. But remember, Collins. Power comes at a price. You can have it all, wealth, influence, fame, but it will require a sacrifice. You must decide if you're ready to make that sacrifice. Collins left that night feeling both exhilarated and terrified. He knew the stakes were higher than ever before. The offer had planted a seed in his heart, and now the question was, could he turn away from it, or would he allow ambition and desire for success to cloud his judgment? As he lay in bed that night, Collins couldn't escape the images of Idara's powerful presence, her offer still echoing in his mind. He knew what the right thing to do was: stay true to the ministry he had built, stay true to the truth. But as the hours passed, and the weight of the decision pressed upon him, he began to question whether truth alone would be enough to take him to the heights he dreamed of. The temptation was too great to ignore. The days following Collins' decision to marry Idara, the chief priestess, were filled with inner turmoil. The weight of his choice pressed heavily on his chest, and yet, every time he thought about it, the allure of power, fame, and influence overshadowed his doubts. His ministry had been growing, but with each passing day, it became more clear to him that the world he was entering would demand a price, one far higher than he had anticipated. Idara was not like any woman Collins had ever encountered. Her presence was magnetic, and her words, once spoken, were not easily forgotten. Her beauty was almost otherworldly, but it was her aura of authority and mysticism that left a lasting impression on him. It was clear that she was not just a spiritual leader, but a force of nature. The very people who followed her did so not just out of reverence, but out of fear. The moment he agreed to marry her, Collins stepped into a world that was beyond anything he had imagined. It wasn't just about joining two lives, it was about merging two realms. The religious world he had known, rooted in faith and truth, was now colliding with the shadowy world of occult power, where the rules were different, and the stakes were much higher. Collins' church, now growing rapidly, was on the verge of becoming something much larger, and with Idara by his side, it was poised to rise to unimaginable heights. She had already begun to work her magic, subtly manipulating situations, influencing key figures, and drawing more people to Collins' ministry with promises of wealth and healing. Her power seemed limitless, and every day, Collins watched in awe as her influence spread like wildfire. But the more he saw the results of their union, the more he realized that the cost was not just material or financial, it was spiritual. The first signs of trouble appeared in the form of whispers. The congregation, once loyal to Collins for his authenticity, began to murmur among themselves. The miracles Collins performed were unlike anything they had seen before. People began flocking to his church not just for salvation, but for instant transformation. Healings were taking place in an almost theatrical manner, with people falling in dramatic fashion, convulsing or screaming in what seemed to be ecstasy. But Collins noticed the hollowness in their eyes when they stood up. There was no genuine healing, no peace in their spirits. It was all a show, a carefully crafted spectacle. He had started this ministry to offer truth, to provide a sanctuary where people could find real healing, but now, it felt as though he was complicit in a lie. One evening, after a particularly extravagant healing service, Collins returned home to find Idara waiting for him in their shared quarters. The air between them was thick with expectation. Idara had already become the driving force behind the church's success, and it was clear to Collins that her influence had not just extended to his ministry, it had extended to him. "Collins," Idara said, her voice smooth and commanding, "you're doing well. Very well. The people are coming in droves, and your influence is growing. But I need more from you. You've made your mark, but it's time to solidify your power. It's time for the next step." Collins sat down, feeling the weight of her words. He had already begun to question the nature of the miracles he was performing, but hearing her say it so directly unsettled him. "What do you mean by the next step?" he asked, though he already had a sinking feeling about what she was implying. Idara smiled, her eyes gleaming with something far darker than he had seen before. "It's time to show the world who you really are, Collins. You've built your empire, but now it's time to make sure nothing can tear it down. To do that, you need to take full ownership of your power. You must claim what's yours. The implication was clear. Collins wasn't just leading a church, he was leading a spiritual army, one that would bow to him as much as to the forces he had aligned himself with. She wanted him to step fully into the role of a spiritual king, to fully embrace the occult powers that had been offered to him, and to lead his people with an iron grip. At first, Collins hesitated. His conscience still clawed at him. He had entered this ministry to make a difference, not to become a puppet for a woman who wielded power as if it were a toy. But every part of him, the part that longed for recognition, for influence, for a legacy, began to see the allure of the path Idara was laying before him. He had already compromised so much, what was one more step into the abyss? The next day, Collins made a decision. He would embrace the full extent of his power. He would perform a final miracle, one so grand and so overwhelming that it would cement his place in the minds of his followers. It would be his declaration that he had risen above all others. It would be his moment to prove that he had claimed what was his. The service was set for the following Sunday. Collins instructed his team to prepare the church as if it were a grand spectacle, every detail meticulously planned. The congregation gathered in anticipation, their eyes filled with excitement, unsure of what was to come but eager for the next display of supernatural power. Collins, however, felt no excitement. Instead, he felt a deep sense of dread as he stood in front of the congregation, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. As the service progressed, Collins performed his usual healing rituals, but this time, there was something different. The air felt charged, as if something dark was descending upon the room. When he called for the final miracle, he could see the eager, almost desperate expressions on the faces of his congregation. They were waiting for him to prove himself, to give them what they had come for. He felt the eyes of the entire room on him, and for the first time, he was aware of the power he held in his hands, not just spiritual power, but worldly power. With Idara's influence at his back, Collins closed his eyes and began to chant the incantations he had learned. The room grew silent, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. He could feel the power surge within him as the words left his lips, and soon, the people in the congregation began to fall, one by one, overcome by what seemed to be divine energy. But it was not divine energy, it was something darker, something that pulsed with a life of its own. The miracle had been performed. The crowd erupted in applause, shouting praises, their faith now fully in Collins. They believed in him, as they believed in the miracles, as they believed in the power that had consumed him. But in that moment, Collins knew he had crossed a line. The price of power had been paid, and it was not just money, fame, or influence, it was his very soul. The truth he had once preached seemed a distant memory, fading in the wake of the spectacle he had created. That night, as he lay beside Idara, he realized that the man he had once been was gone. The man who had left Pastor Geoffrey's ministry in search of truth and authenticity was no more. In his place stood something else, something that had been born from ambition, greed, and the price of power. Idara smiled as she looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of triumph and expectation. "You've made the right choice, Collins," she said softly. "Now, we can rule together." Collins didn't respond. His heart felt heavy, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had everything he had ever wanted, but at what cost? The decision that Collins had feared for so long had finally come to a head. After months of internal conflict, sleepless nights, and constant battles within his heart, he found himself at a breaking point. The pressure to perform, to deliver miracles, to give the people what they wanted, what they expected, had almost consumed him. And yet, it wasn't just the ministry that was in jeopardy. His love for Idara, and the spiritual pull she represented, had become an ever-present force in his life. Despite his deep-rooted belief in Jesus Christ, Collins couldn't ignore the undeniable truth: Idara's world was seductive, powerful, and real. Every encounter with her left him questioning his own understanding of power, faith, and his place in the world. Their discussions had become more than theological debates, they had become a battle for his soul. But as much as Idara's influence had grown, something inside Collins refused to let go of the foundation he had built his life upon. He had seen the miracles of Christ, experienced the peace that only Jesus could offer, and he had seen how far his faith had brought him. And yet, here he was, on the verge of losing himself to a force that promised immediate results, a world where power could be controlled and manipulated. But something had changed. Idara's own struggles had become more evident. She had always exuded confidence, a sense of invincibility that seemed unshakable. Yet, as their relationship deepened, Collins began to notice cracks in her armor. The once proud priestess who wielded her spiritual power like a weapon had started to question the very foundation of her beliefs. It began subtly, at first. Idara had started to ask more questions, to reflect on her past in ways that made Collins see her in a new light. She wasn't just the powerful, confident woman he had admired from the beginning. She was also a person who had been deeply shaped by the very same forces she had once embraced unconditionally. And now, she was beginning to doubt them. One night, after a particularly difficult sermon where Collins had spoken about the power of redemption and the grace of God, Idara came to him. She was quiet, her usual confident demeanor replaced by a contemplative stillness. "Collins," she began softly, her voice filled with uncertainty, "I've been thinking about everything you've said. About Jesus, about the power of the Holy Spirit. And I can't deny that what you speak of. It's different. It's not what I've known, but it's real. I've seen the way people's lives change when they truly believe in it. And I've seen the peace it brings. I don't think I've ever known peace like that." Collins was stunned. He had expected many things from Idara, but this moment of vulnerability, was something he had never anticipated. He had always assumed that she was unshakable in her beliefs, that she was beyond the reach of the gospel he preached. But now, he saw her differently. He saw the woman behind the priestess, a woman who was searching, just like him. "Idara," Collins said softly, his heart swelling with emotion, "you don't have to be afraid of this. You don't have to fight it anymore. The truth of Jesus Christ is not about power, it's about love, grace, and forgiveness. And it's never too late to come to him." For the first time, Idara looked up at him with something akin to surrender in her eyes. "But I've been living a lie for so long, Collins. My entire life has been based on power, on controlling forces that I believed were my path to greatness. How can I just turn away from all that? How can I believe in a God who doesn't give me the power to control my own destiny?" Collins took her hands in his voice gentle yet firm. "Because Jesus isn't about control, Idara. He's about surrender. It's about trusting that he knows what's best for you, that his plan for your life is greater than anything you could ever imagine. You don't have to control your future, he already has it in his hands." Idara stood silently, her gaze fixed on Collins as though searching for something in his words. Her mind was torn between the life she had known and the peace she longed for but couldn't fully grasp. The internal struggle was evident on her face. But Collins didn't let go of her hands. He wasn't going to push her, but he wasn't going to let her walk away from this moment either. For a long time, there was only silence. The weight of the decision lay heavy between them. Collins had done everything he could, he had spoken from his heart, shared the gospel, shown her the truth he had clung to for so many years. Now, the choice was Idara's. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm ready, Collins. But I know one thing, I don't want to live in darkness anymore. I want to know the truth, even if it means giving up everything I thought I knew." Tears welled in Collins' eyes as he embraced her. He knew this was a pivotal moment, not just for her, but for both of them. Together, they could move forward, step by step, into a future that was built on love, grace, and faith. The next Sunday, Idara stood beside Collins at the front of the church, surrounded by the congregation that had supported him through thick and thin. It was a quiet moment, but one of profound significance. Collins had never imagined that he would stand there with Idara by his side, ready to make this declaration before the people who had followed him for so long. As the congregation watched, Collins led Idara in a prayer of salvation, her voice trembling as she spoke the words for the first time, Jesus Christ, I believe in you. I accept you as my Lord and Savior. I surrender my life to you, and I trust in your plan for me. And in that moment, as Idara's voice merged with Collins, something miraculous happened. The weight that had been hanging over her, the darkness that had clouded her heart for so long, began to lift. The peace that Collins had spoken of, the peace that only Jesus could bring, flooded her soul. It wasn't the immediate transformation she had expected. It wasn't about power or spectacle. It was something deeper, more profound, a change of heart that couldn't be explained by any ritual or magic. Idara had finally come to the truth. And as she stood there, hand in hand with Collins, she knew that her journey was just beginning. The battle for her soul had been won, not through power, but through love and surrender to Jesus Christ. Their wedding was a celebration of this transformation, a quiet ceremony in the church where they had both found redemption. It was not a grand spectacle, but a simple affirmation of their commitment to each other and to the faith they now shared. Idara, once a powerful priestess, had bowed to the supreme power of Jesus Christ, and together, they would begin a new life, grounded in truth and faith. As they exchanged vows, Idara smiled, her heart full of peace. Jesus Christ is the most supreme power, she whispered to Collins, her voice filled with conviction. And I will follow him, now and forever. The journey had been long, but it was only just beginning. I hope you enjoyed this incredible story. If you did, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Don't forget to hit the like button and share this with your family and friends. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.